Which one of these is better? This is a collection of Franz Kafka stories. And this is a collection of Franz Kafka stories. They're not exactly the same. This one, for example, has the Metamorphosis in it. But many of Kafka's most iconic stories are in both of these books. Besides getting the one that has Metamorphosis in it, knowing which one of these to read is a complicated question. Because aside from a few details, the only thing that's different about them is the translator. This Everyman collection of Franz Kafka stories primarily includes the original German to English translations by Willa and Edwin Muir. As a side note, reportedly Willa Muir did most of the translations in here and her husband Edwin just occasionally helped. But these translations go back decades, and for most, if not all of the stories in here, they were the original translations. But this is a new book, a collection of Franz Kafka's best short stories, selected and translated by Alexander Starrett, who also wrote an introduction to this book. So which one do you read? The simple answer is the one with the better translation, but how do you know that? Well, let's finally answer that question. How do you know what makes a good translation? If you enjoy this video, if you learn something, if you appreciate the video existing, maybe consider supporting me on Patreon, or hit the thanks button below the video. As a professional critic who often talks about, promotes, and reviews various works in translation from countries and languages all around the world, I get asked this question constantly, because I often praise the translation of a book. And people ask me, rightly so, how do you know it's a good translation? To start with, I'm going to quote a translator. The following is a quote from Korean to English translator Deborah Smith, who was also the founder of Tilted Axis Press, a wonderful independent publisher. See, Deborah came under fire for her translation of the International Booker Prize winning The Vegetarian by Han Kang. And here is her defense, which I think works as a brilliant start to understanding what makes a great translation. To say that my English translation of The Vegetarian is a completely different book from the Korean original is, of course, in one sense, entirely correct, since there is no such thing as a truly literal translation. No two languages' grammars match. Their vocabularies diverge. Even punctuation has a different weight. There can be no such thing as a translation that is not creative. And while most of us translators think of ourselves as faithful, definitions of faithfulness can differ. Because languages function differently, much of translation is about achieving a similar effect by different means. Not only are difference, change, and interpretation completely normal, but they are in fact an integral part of faithfulness. I adore the eloquence with which she speaks about this topic. In that quote, Deborah talks about the fact that you cannot literally translate anything. Translation is an act of creation. A good literary translator is also a creative person. And I've said this before, but what's amazing about reading a work in translation is that it has passed through the minds of two people at least. A novel begins in the mind of one person, and when it is translated, it gets pushed through the mind of another person. It is created once, and then it is created again. When a translator reads it, digests it, and churns out something entirely different that is also a faithful adaptation. And I think by viewing translation this way, it becomes very obvious what makes a good translation. Was it written well by the translator? Is there power behind the words? Is it playful? Is it pretty? Is it poetic? These are easy questions that we ask about literature all the time. And all these things apply when we're talking about translation as well. To answer my question from the beginning, Alexander Starrett's translation is much, much better. And I'll prove it to you. I'm going to read you the opening line of one Franz Kafka story. It's one of his more famous stories, and Willa Muir titled it An Imperial Message. Alexander Starrett titled it A Message from the Emperor. Already different choices being made, but just listen to the difference in these translations. Here's Muir's, the first ever translation of this story into English. The Emperor, so a parable runs, has sent a message to you, the humble subject, the insignificant shadow, cowering in the remotest distance before the imperial sun. The emperor from his deathbed has sent a message to you alone. Now let's read Alexander Starrett's, at the time of recording, the newest translation of that story. The emperor, they say, has sent you, you alone, his lowly subject, you tiny shadow thrown far off into the furthest corner by the imperial sun, you, of all people, the emperor has sent a message from his deathbed. There is a completely different tone between these two translations. Both feel the same in terms of meaning, but there is a snideness to this one that I really enjoy. Beyond that, Muir's translation is just so much more clunky. Look at the opening few words. The emperor, so a parable runs. What? Starrett's reads, the emperor, they say, right? Starrett's is better. It flows better, it makes more sense. It's not an awkward mess of words. And some of this, of course, is about time. These were translated decades ago. This is more modern. But that in and of itself shows that it's good to retranslate things as time moves on and language shifts and literature shifts and trends shift. The insignificant shadow cowering in the remotest distance before the imperial sun. You tiny shadow thrown far off into the furthest corner by the imperial sun. Again, better. A little bit funnier, a little bit snarky and snide, and a slightly more creative use of language, I would argue. Now let's really quickly look at the last line of this story. Muir's translation says, "But you sit at your window when evening falls and dream it to yourself." Starrett's, on the other hand, says, "But you sit at your window and dream of what it says when evening comes." Very similar to each other, but the clauses within the sentence have been shifted around and reordered, and I still like Starrett's better. Now you should be getting an idea of what makes a good translation. They are both translating the same Kafka story, but with different energy, and Starrett's has more verve, there is playfulness to it, and if you continue to read this whole collection, you will laugh way more than you would laugh at Muir's translation. And speaking as a fan of Kafka who's read like 3 different translations of the Metamorphosis, for example, Kafka was really funny. Sometimes you'll laugh with him, he is telling you a joke. Sometimes you'll laugh at him because Kafka's stories are kind of pathetic and weaselly. And I love doing both. But Starrett clearly has a really good idea of what makes Kafka tick, what made his stories so funny, and what made them so politically sharp and often really good parables or satires. There is a tone and an energy and a playfulness and a sense of humor in Starrett's book. His translations have a tone to them that matches the philosophy and the politics of Kafka's stories. And so if you want to understand what makes a good translation, just ask yourself about how it's written. The tone, the humor, the beauty of the language and the way it's structured. Does it flow well? And is it supposed to? Does the way that it's been translated match the tone and the themes and the plot and the politics of the book itself? When you're asking yourself what makes a good translation, ask yourself what makes good writing. Because a translator is a writer. I really hope this has helped. It's a difficult thing to answer, but I think that's because people sometimes make too much of the question. It's not really as complicated as we seem to think it is. You don't have to speak 100 languages to know what makes a good translation, as long as you can understand what makes good writing. If you enjoyed this video, my channel is almost entirely supported by my patrons over at patreon.com/WillowTalksBooks. So if you want to show your support for my channel, so I can keep making fun videos like this, consider supporting me on Patreon. Even $1 a month goes a long way. And if you can't do that, maybe hit the thanks button below the video and leave a tip. Thank you in advance and subscribe for books.